They say that if you're in this old RAF watch office and the atmosphere suddenly shifts, you don't hang around to find out why, you run. Dogs refuse to go near it. Phones that aren't even connected still ring. People have heard footsteps on staircases that don't even exist anymore. And even the men who built this museum, hardened, no-nonsense farmers, have had terrifying, unexplainable encounters in here that left them bolting for the door in broad daylight. But these creepy encounters didn't just materialise out of nowhere. This tower stood at the heart of a wartime airfield where hundreds of young men flew out and many never came back. The controllers inside the RAF East Kirkby watch office were, in a lot of cases, the last to see these men alive. But in death, some say that at least a few of them have returned. But are they solely responsible for the strange goings on here, and all over the site of what is now the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre? Or could it be something else entirely? So in case you didn't know, the county of Lincolnshire in the UK, it's not called Bomber County for no reason. During World War II, there were more airfields here than in any other part of the country. They were absolutely everywhere. The flat landscape made it perfect for long runways, and being on the east coast, pilots had a relatively straight shot over the North Sea towards occupied Europe. On the other side of this though, it made Lincolnshire a huge target for German bombers. But they tried to throw them off with the use of decoy airfields. One of these decoys was a small site that was just down the road from a little village called East Kirkby, and the whole aim was to distract the enemy away from the nearby Coningsby and Manby air stations. And it was what was known as a K-type decoy, which was a fake airfield built to attract enemy bomber crews away during daylight raids. And these sites, they were laid out on big open fields, often with dummy aircraft, painted canvas hangars, fake bomb dumps and fuel stores, and even old vehicles positioned to look like the real thing from the air. And if you were looking down on it from the sky, yeah, it did look pretty realistic. Hopefully realistic enough that you would waste your bombs on empty fields rather than on the important stations close by. And apparently this site did its job a little too well. The decoy site actually ended up being hit, with at least one bomb dropped right on it. But the boundary of the airfield came right up to the village of East Kirkby, and tragically, according to the sources, there were fatalities. By June 1941 though, the decoy site was actually decommissioned, and soon after, approval was given to build a real airfield. And so 2 years later, in August 1943, RAF East Kirkby, codenamed Silk Sheen, officially opened as a Bomber Command station. And Bomber Command, these guys did not come to play. They were unbelievably courageous, flying at night into enemy territory, facing German night fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and even the danger of colliding with other bombers in the dark. To put it into perspective, serving in Bomber Command was statistically more dangerous than being in the infantry on the Western Front during the First World War. You know, those men who went over the top, climbing out of the trenches into no man's land and running straight towards machine gun fire. They had a better chance of making it home than a Bomber Command airman. Just gonna let that sink in. On the 29th of August 1943, the Lancaster bombers of No. 57 Squadron flew into the newly opened RAF East Kirkby, and one local remembered it super well. His name was Fred Panton, and he's going to be incredibly important a bit later on in this story, but at the time he was about 12 years old and remembered it being a sunny, clear Sunday as he and his mates watched all of these Lancaster bombers circle the new airfield to land. From then on, whenever the drone of those Merlin engines started up, they'd race over to the runway to see the crews off, with the gunners sometimes waving back to them as the bombers roared off into the sky. And these boys, they would watch them disappear off into the distance, hoping that they would all make it back safe, but knowing deep down that many of them wouldn't. Because that was just the cold, hard, bleak reality. In November 1943, No. 630 Squadron was formed at RAF East Kirkby, and both squadrons would fly Avro Lancasters on some of the most ambitious and dangerous raids of the war. But even if they survived their operations, life back at the station could turn deadly in an instant. On the 17th of April 1945, ground crews were bombing up the Lancasters, basically loading them, getting them ready for the night's raid on Chemnitz in Germany. But during that process, a 1,000-pound bomb was accidentally dropped onto the tarmac. Because it had already been fused, it detonated instantly, setting off the rest of the Lancaster's payload. The explosion ripped through the dispersal area, destroying 6 aircraft and damaging 14 more. 4 men were killed that night at East Kirkby, and 13 others were injured. That night's raid was cancelled, and just over a week later, later, on the 25th of April 1945, the squadrons at RAF East Kirkby flew their final wartime operation. By the end of the war, the air station had seen a lot and suffered heavily. In total, 212 operations had flown from here between 1943 and 1945, but 164 Lancasters were lost through enemy action and accidents, which is just a terrifying number to think about, and goes to show just how dangerous it was to be in Bomber Command. After Victory in Europe Day though, No. 630 Squadron disbanded in July 1945, and soon after, No. 460 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, they moved in. They were gearing up to head into the Pacific as part of Tiger Force, which was basically going to be this massive long-range bomber group supporting the planned invasion of Japan. But after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that invasion never happened. And so 460 Squadron disbanded that October, and 57 Squadron, the original guys who had first moved in, they followed a month later. After the war, things at East Kirkby quieted down pretty quickly. The station was placed on care and maintenance, meaning it was just basically mothballed, just kind of kept ticking over, doing the bare minimum until they figured out what they wanted to do with it. In the years that followed, both the Australians and the Americans stayed here for short periods of time, but they didn't last too long, and in 1958, RAF East Kirkby was closed permanently. In the village of East Kirkby though, close to the now closed air station, one local family, like so many others after the war, they were still grieving the loss of a loved one who had paid the ultimate price as part of Bomber Command. The family I'm talking about is the Pantons. Fred, the boy who had stood and watched the Lancasters arrive at East Kirkby, he'd had an older brother called Christopher, who had been one of those young men flying those dangerous operations, and in the very early hours of the morning of the 31st of March 1944, Christopher had been killed in action. He'd been a flight engineer with 433 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, flying in a Halifax Mark III, and they'd taken off from Skipton-on-Swale to take part in a huge night raid, the Nuremberg Raid, which ended up being the worst night in Bomber Command's history for losses. The Halifax that Christopher was flying in was shot down over the Bamberg district, where witnesses say that the wreckage burned for days. Christopher, along with 4 other crew members, died in the crash, with the remaining 3 taken as prisoners of war. Just utterly devastating. Something like 95 planes were shot down that night, over 500 killed. Back in Lincolnshire, Fred Panton and his other brother, Harold, they were obviously heartbroken, but determined that one day they would do something to keep Christopher's memory alive, and really honour all of the men from Bomber Command who had never made it home. And so years later, they decided that they were going to buy a real Second World War bomber as a tribute. At one point, they actually had their eye on a Halifax bomber that they could have bought for £100, but their dad shut that idea down very quickly, telling them in no uncertain terms that Mr. Panton Sr. was not going to have a bomber parked up at his farm as a massive in-your-face reminder every time he went to go and feed the chickens. Just nope, not having it. Okay, kind of understandable, you can see where he's coming from. At the very least though, Fred and Harold, they wanted to go and visit Dernbach War Cemetery, where Christopher had been buried. Just pay their respects. But again, their dad refused. He wanted absolutely nothing more to do with the war, and that was that. Final word on the matter. It wasn't until much later on in the 1970s that he suddenly seemed to have a change of heart. He called Fred over and said, "You know what? Get yourself over to Germany and bring me back a photo of Chrissy's grave." And, well, the brothers didn't hesitate. But that visit to the cemetery, to see where their brother had been laid to rest, that reignited the desire in Fred and Harold, that they wanted to do something big. They wanted to create that tribute that they had been thinking about before. And so, again, they thought about acquiring a bomber. And that was when the Lancaster bomber, serial number NX611, came into the story. In June of 1970, she'd been flown into Blackpool to become the centrepiece of a little outdoor museum at Squiresgate Airport. However, that whole thing had collapsed within a couple of years because of financial and security problems. And so NX611 was placed up for auction. And who should be right there to see her? That's right, the Panton brothers. However, it wasn't going to be that simple, no happily ever afters just yet. The highest bid at auction was £9,500, nowhere near the 20 grand reserve. So she was pulled from the sale and eventually bought privately by the Right Honourable Lord Lilford. Fred and Harold, though, they never lost sight of her. They kept in touch with her new owner, even as she went off to stand as gate guardian at RAF Scampton. Guardian. And that little bit of effort, that paid off. Because a few years later, after a couple of hiccups and whatnot, which tends to be the case when you're doing anything like this, they struck a deal with Lord Lilford's agent, and in September 1983, NX611 was officially theirs. She had to stay at RAF Scampton for a couple more years though, and complete a 10-year run as Gate Guardian, but that was fine, because now the Panton brothers had their bomber, they needed somewhere to put her. Funnily enough, around that time, parts of the old East Kirkby airfield were going up for sale in 3 different plots. So Fred and Harold, already having their own poultry farm in the area at this point, they went to go and look at the section where the control tower still stood. Apparently, they walked out onto the balcony and looked out over the old runways, and Fred said just in that moment that if they could bring the Lancaster here, there would be nowhere else like it in the world. And what a tribute to Christopher and all of Bomber Command that would be. So, another deal was done and the Panton brothers purchased the land. In July 1987, it was time for NX611 to come home, and so she made her journey by road, from Scampton to East Kirkby, 16 years after they had first seen her at Blackpool. 2 years after that, in July 1989, the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre officially opened, and it's only gone from strength to strength since then. Today, the centre displays a collection of items and exhibits. They've got other vehicles and even aircraft, including a de Havilland Mosquito, but the star of the show is still NX611, nicknamed Just Jane. She was restored to a point where she now has a taxi licence, and you can actually pay to ride in the bomber. All 4 Merlin engines running as she taxis down the airfield, which is just unbelievably cool on so many levels. But the money raised from that goes towards paying for her restoration, as each winter they take her back into the hangar and do more work on her because they want to get her airworthy again. Yep. I'd like to think that Christopher would be proud of what his brothers have built here. What started as a simple tribute to their fallen brother has grown into preserving RAF East Kirkby's history. Fred unfortunately passed away in 2013, but Harold is still involved, and now younger generations of the Panton family as well. It's all just very much a family affair. Fred's legacy and Christopher's memory are still all over this place, and especially in that Lancaster that they made sure didn't end up just rotting away somewhere. And just reading about the centre and the reasons behind why it started and the passion that went into making this place what it is, you can already tell that it's special. You might hear some strange stories that you won't find on the display boards or in the history books. And there's one building in particular where a lot of these stories seem to centre around. It's of course the old watch office, or what, as time went on, became known as the control tower. Basically the beating heart of East Kirkby during the war, where pilots were booked in and out. During every operation, these rooms would have been packed with people making rapid decisions in a flurry of telephone calls and paperwork. These days it's set up to give visitors a sense of what it would have been like back then. But it seems that the energy of this place might be giving things a little boost, because this building is said to be a major hotspot for unexplained activity. If you're going to experience something strange at East Kirkby, chances are it's going to be here. Over the years, countless people have reported hearing strange sounds inside the building. Most often, it's footsteps coming up the stairs, but when you look, there's no one there. Even a report in 2004 mentioned hearing footsteps clanging up the external staircase, although at that time, that was impossible, because the staircase had been removed so that it could be restored. Wasn't even there. And reports like this, they actually go back to before the museum ever even opened. There was a guy called Dennis Brown who was up in the signals room doing some soldering work when he heard the unmistakable sound of someone come barging up the stairs, who then proceeded to stride past his room and throw open the door to the room next to him. Okay, that was a lot, whoever this guy was. So Dennis went around looking for them. Yeah, no one around at all. And there was no way for anyone to escape either. They would have had to go past him to get downstairs, which never happened. No explanation for what he heard. The sounds of telephones as well, that seems to be a huge one. Although a lot of people say now, yeah, it's just sound effects playing in the watch office, that's all it is. But apparently some of the weirdest stories happened before these sound effects were even being played. Back in the late 2000s, a visitor was standing quietly in the tower, reading some of the displays, when one of the old-fashioned phones started ringing, loud enough to make him jump. As anyone reasonable though, he just assumed it was part of the display until someone walked into the room, who must have heard it too, because they asked the guy, Did you just Hear the phone ring? Yeah, cool little effect, right? No, the guy said. Those phones, they shouldn't be ringing. They're not connected to anything. Okay. Still, though, you might not be convinced. Something even weirder is that not everyone in the room hears the phones go off. In 1993, there was a woman called Sue Smithson who was visiting with her friends when she heard the exact same thing, that piercing, old-school telephone sound. She started looking around, wondering where on earth this ear-splitting telephone ringing was coming from, but her friends just stared at her. They had no idea what she was on about because they couldn't hear a thing. That seems to be a little harder to explain away. Some people also claim to see shadow figures moving along the walls inside the watch office. Just tall, human-shaped shadows that glide across the room, as though there are people going about their important work even when there's nothing around that could be casting them. Others have looked up into the tower late at night and seen strange lights coming from inside, long after the site's been locked up. In 1992, this was witnessed by a whole group of people when the Caravan Club rocked up to stay the night on the old airfield. They parked up near the hangar with the watch office a little ways back behind a locked gate, and the club chairman had a key to that gate, just in case anyone needed to nip over and empty their chemical toilet over in that direction. But later that night, a few members noticed something a bit odd, because there was a light that was shining out of one of the tower's windows. Thinking that someone must have wandered over there to go and have a nose about or something, the chairman went to check, but the gate was still locked and everyone was accounted for. They'd all gone back to their caravans, but all night that light stayed on. And it was enough for the chairman to ask Fred and Harold Panton the next day, "Oh, did someone leave a light on accidentally inside the tower last night or something?" They replied, saying, "Absolutely not. There's no way. There's no electricity in the tower at all. Impossible to leave any sort of light on." Well, that was super weird, because that was when the Caravan Club went on to say what they had actually seen. The light in the tower, it wasn't a normal room light or anything like that. The light had been a bright, glowing green colour. And apparently, over the years, this green light has been seen a bunch of different times, but no one can explain why. It's only on random nights as well that this appears. It's not like it's one of those fire escape green lights or anything like that. But the thing that really unnerves people the most in that building is the feeling, as if someone's there in the room with them. You can feel it as soon as you step inside, and it doesn't leave until you're walking away out the building. Fred and Harold themselves, they both knew about it too. It'd become pretty much immediately apparent that there was something weird in the control tower as soon as they took it on. Back in 1984, before the centre opened, two guys decided to spend the night up in the observation room to see if they could get to the bottom of what was going on. Throughout the night, they didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, they didn't see anything strange, but what they did say was that they could feel something. They both described it as this kind of just presence, like the room wasn't as empty as it appeared on the surface. One of them said it felt watchful, like they were being judged, kind of assessed. Not necessarily in a nasty way though, just like someone was checking them out to see if they belonged there. By the morning, they'd both agreed that it was as if the spirits of the old bomber command crew had been sizing them up all night. Which, I mean, is fair. In their time, they wouldn't have allowed any old civilian to just go and have a wander around. So the consensus seems to be, it's unsettling, but never really doing anything. Up to this point, anyway. I don't know, if that was me in there, whether I would think that that would be creepier than if someone just jumped out and said hello so I could just run out screaming of the building and just get it over with. But loads of visitors in the years since have said the exact same sort of thing. One woman visiting said that she suddenly felt this freezing cold patch at the bottom of the stairs and that it was like someone was standing right next to her watching her, but obviously no one was there. A lot of people went on to say that while it doesn't really feel bad, although the vibe is definitely creepier once the sun has gone down, it just sometimes feels like you're surrounded by busy people, even though you can't see any of them. But then, on rarer occasions, the mood just flips, and that's when you need to be worried. A guy called Peter Parnham, who once worked at the centre, he said that he was in the tower one day with a colleague, and initially, everything was fine, totally cool. But then, out of nowhere, the air just dropped. The atmosphere turned and went heavy, and this wave of fear hit him just completely out of the blue. He legged it out of the door, completely panicked, not even turning back to say anything to his colleague, just a complete save yourself moment. As it turned out, she had picked up on the exact same thing as Peter did, only her instinct wasn't fight or flight, it was just freeze. She was rooted to the spot, completely unable to move as the dread took over her. She started calling out for Peter, not realising that he'd already disappeared off into the horizon. But apparently, Peter refused to go into the watch office for years after that, and that he always made sure to tell people that if you feel that change, just get out. In a kind of, you'll know what I mean if it happens to you. Very interesting that they both picked up on that change in energy in there though. Something in their lizard brain was tuned into something going on. But even the dogs know better too. Apparently they'll pull on the lead to get away, or they'll start barking or whining, refusing to go near the door, won't even step inside. So they can sense whatever it is too. Fred Panton, he had his own terrifying encounter with whatever this energy was as well. He was in there one Sunday afternoon painting the steps. It was getting a bit dark, but nothing creepy about taking off a Sunday afternoon job, you know? But halfway through, he got that uneasy feeling, like something was in his head going, you need to leave. He tried to ignore it. I mean, come on, I've got a job to do. This is just silly. There's nothing going on, but the feeling just kept getting worse. I need to get out. He still carried on though, and actually shouted out loud, you're not gonna force me out until I've done the job I came to do. Enforcing boundaries with the ghosts. Everyone knows where they stand then. I love that. Eventually, he got to the last step. He'd moved the cushion that he'd been kneeling on and was about to start painting when he noticed it was already wet, with fresh paint. But it certainly wasn't from Fred. Why would he paint the bottom step when he was going top to bottom? Almost as if something had finished the job for him. Like a, right mate, I've helped you out, now I mean it. Get out of here. Funnily enough, he did. Just dropped his brushes and ran. But whatever's going on inside the tower, it doesn't seem to just stay inside. People have seen the figures of airmen striding across the airfield towards the building, like they're going to report for duty. One figure who was seen was a guy in a US Air Force uniform, carrying a parachute in his arms. And some people think that they might know exactly who he is, because on the 30th of December 1944, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed the Belle of Liberty, was limping home from an operation over Germany. She'd taken serious damage, lost an engine, and the pilot, Lieutenant Joseph Van Straten, realised that he wasn't going to be able to make it all the way back to their own station at Poddington in Bedfordshire. So he had to think quickly, and he decided to try and put her down at RAF East Kirkby. The problem was, it was a completely unfamiliar place, and so on the first try, they overshot the runway. The watch officer at East Kirkby told the Fortress to go round again, make another circuit, but again, they couldn't land. He wasn't lined up right, and if they'd have let him land, he would have caused a crash anyway. But at this point, the crew were fighting to keep the aircraft in the air. Another engine was failing, with its prop windmilling, basically just spinning uselessly, dragging the plane down. They tried one last time, pulling up to clear a small hill, but it wasn't enough. The B-17 crashed in a field about 2 miles north of the air station, and all 9 men on board were killed. Fred Panton, yep, that same Fred who went on to found the museum, he was actually one of the first people to reach the crash site as a boy. He'd seen the Flying Fortress come down, and he said that he knew straight away that there was nothing anyone could have done for the crew. But years later, Fred might have seen something else connected to the crash. One evening, he'd been working late at East Kirkby, and decided that he fancied himself a fish and chip supper, as you do. As he drove past the control tower, he saw this tall man walking towards the grass towards it, carrying what he initially thought were a bunch of plastic bags in his arms. Fred didn't think much of it at the time. The building was all locked up. Maybe he was just a guy who wanted to have a look around. Whatever, it was not going to cause any harm, so he just carried on. Eyes on the prize, that fish and chips. It was only later when it clicked. People had been talking to him about seeing a ghostly airman doing that exact same thing, carrying not plastic bags, but a parachute. But some now think that this is the figure of Lieutenant Joseph Van Straten, trying to figure out why RAF East Kirkby wouldn't let him land. Interestingly though, once the control tower was fully restored, he was never seen again. The sightings completely stopped. Maybe he got to where he was going, or maybe he just understood that the watch office was only doing its job, trying to keep everyone on the ground safe. Other figures have still been seen though, walking across the old runway towards the control tower. One man, Gordon West, he said that he'd had an experience at East Kirkby back in 1983. At that point, the place was still very derelict, obviously, but he still didn't want to go trespassing, so he just hung back a bit, admiring the control tower from afar. While he was standing there though, he saw a man in full flying gear walk walked straight towards the tower. Gordon watched him go inside and figured that it must still be used for something. They couldn't be flying though, as there weren't any aircraft around at all. Regardless though, he started to make his way over to ask who owned the place, see if he could get permission to go and take a peek inside. But as he walked up, he saw another man in the same kind of flying uniform, and then two more men, all of them heading for the tower. He said that they looked completely real, totally solid, until he got close enough to see their faces. And he said that they were completely, unnaturally white. And at that moment, he knew that he wasn't looking at someone living. So it definitely feels like something is going on at the control tower. And being the centre of the air station for so long, that does make sense. That doesn't mean that the rest of the place is quiet though. It was back in the early 1970s, the runway was being used one evening for people flying radio-controlled planes. This one guy, his model lost signal and veered off into a part of the airfield that he hadn't been before, and so off he went to fetch it. As he got closer though, he was suddenly hit with this overwhelming sense of dread. Like everything just felt wrong. No reason, nothing outwardly had changed, but yet he just couldn't get out of that area fast enough. Years later, he found out that that exact spot had been where the tragic incident had happened in April 1945, when the bomb had exploded and killed 4 people. He said he hadn't been back to the air station since and had no intention of it either. But there have been even more strange reports at the centre, specifically in the hangar, where they've got a bunch of different displays, including part of the wreckage of a Spitfire that had crashed not too far away. It was piloted by Flying Officer Norman Alexander Watt with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was only 21 years old when he took off from RAF Digby, which is about half an hour away from East Kirkby, back in July 1943, flying a Supermarine Spitfire BL-655. It was just meant to be a routine training flight, but 6 miles away from Digby, he lost control. The aircraft went into an inverted dive that Norman couldn't recover from, and he crashed into a field, and he didn't make it. The wreckage stayed buried for almost 50 years, 9 feet down in the mud, until the Lincolnshire Aircraft Recovery Group dug it up in 1989. When they pulled the Spitfire out of the ground, they realised that some of him was still there too. So those remains were reinterred with him at his final resting place in Scopwick. The wreckage of his Spitfire was put on display at East Kirkby in 1991, but ever since that display went up, a few people have said that they've seen something a bit odd around it. A figure dressed like a pilot walking slowly away from the exhibit, like he's just finished looking at it himself. Could it be that people know Norman's story after seeing the wreckage and put 2 and 2 together? I mean, nothing drives home the brutal realities of what those pilots went through than seeing a wreckage like that right in front of you. Or maybe, could it be Norman still keeping an eye on his Spitfire? But that's not the only story from the hangar. On multiple occasions, visitors have claimed that they would be standing, reading the displays, when they'd be interrupted by the voice of a young girl. Only when they turn around to look at her, there's no one there. We don't know who she is though, no one really seems to have any idea. But really, it's all across the site. Visitors and staff have experiences that they can't explain. One person was in one of the old huts, and with only another person in there, so not crowded or anything, but both of them heard clear footsteps coming around the corner of a display case. They both looked, expecting someone to appear, but the room was empty. No one showed themselves. But echoes from people are only half of it, as the roaring sound of Merlin engines have been heard all over East Kirkby, sounding like they're coming into land. Which is impossible, as Just Jane is very much still grounded for now, not quite airworthy just yet. The chapel on the site also, maybe unsurprisingly, has its own kind of energy too. One visitor said that they had to leave because the emotion in there hit them like a wall, and they started crying before they even realised why. Others have talked about the sudden, strong smell of sweet tobacco, even when the place was empty. Whether that's more to do with just the weight of what the crew sacrificed here. I mean, at RAF East Kirkby alone, they lost so many ground and air crew. But then even off-site, there's a really strange story. A driver heading past East Kirkby late one night said that a parachutist, dressed in full World War II gear, dropped right in front of their car. They were obviously absolutely bewildered, slammed on the brakes and jumped out to find no one there, just a quiet road. So with East Kirkby, are the strange goings on down to the spirits of the airmen who never came home? Maybe. Or maybe it's just the weight of everything that happened here. The loss, the fear, the high emotion. Maybe that energy has just imprinted on the place. Either way, if the atmosphere in that old watch office suddenly changes, you'll know exactly what to do. Doing the research for this one, oh man, I fell straight down that rabbit hole. Every single lead, every story. I could not let it go. And I think it's because with East Kirkby, it's different. The museum itself was built out of pure love and respect. The Panton brothers didn't go into it trying to build a museum to gain attention or profit. They wanted to make a tribute first and foremost. But then on top of that, you've obviously got the airfield, being this place where hundreds of men took off into the night and never came back. So this story, again, it's really a story about the people behind the history. And that always just makes episodes like this hit so much harder when I'm putting them together. Even so far as the little detail I came across when Eddie Burks, the famous Ghosthunter, he visited in 1994 and said to Fred Panton that Christopher was right there with them, watching over what Fred and Harold had built. So yeah, I do believe that this place is haunted. Maybe by the crews who flew from here and never came home, maybe by the ones who actually died here, but definitely by the energy of everything that happened during the war. You can just feel it. But let me know what you think, your theories, or even your own experiences if you've ever been to East Kirkby. I'm hoping to get a visit in very soon because I am now obsessed with this place. But also, just want to make a shout out to everyone who recommended the Ghost Stations books, written by Bruce Barrymore Halpenny after the RAF Montrose episode. I now own all 8 of them, and again, I forgot to bring them in with me, so I cannot show you, but I have all 8 physical copies, so expect another one of these episodes very soon, because clearly I cannot get enough of haunted air stations. But anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and also if you're feeling generous, it would really mean a lot if you would hype the video. It really does help me out. But if you love what I'm doing here and you're not already, please do subscribe too. I'd love to have you back for another one of these. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go and get a drink of water. I can't guarantee that the naffy is going to be open, so make sure you're properly hydrated. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. For anybody that only watches the content for the animals, first of all, don't blame you at all. Ernie has been here the entire time. He's just been sleeping at my feet just by the door. So he counts as being part of this episode too.